In the earliest years of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium of Man was still young and the stars seemed close enough to touch, there existed a rare and fragile certainty, the belief that humanity's long night had finally ended. For countless millennia before, old Earth had known isolation, collapse, and silence. The great stellar realms of humanity's forgotten golden age had fractured into warring fragments. Warp storms had swallowed trade routes. Civilizations had risen only to fall alone. Knowledge had withered into myth, and myth into fae. Across the galaxy, human worlds survived in wildly different forms, some clinging to scraps of lost technology, others ruled by tyrants, cults, or superstition. Many did not even remember they were part of something larger. Then came the unification of terror. From the ashes of techno-barbarian warlords and irradiated wastelands, a single ruler brought order to a broken world. He did not claim kingship in the manner of ancient tyrants, nor divinity as later ages would whisper. He spoke instead of reason, unity, and destiny. His vision was vast, and his will unyielding. Those who stood against him were swept aside, and those who joined him became the foundation of something new. He was known simply as the Emperor. When at last terror stood united, he did not turn inward to enjoy the fruits of conquest. His gaze was fixed upon the stars. Humanity, he believed, belonged not on one world, but among all worlds. The scattered branches of the species would be found, brought back into the fold, and bound together under a single banner, the Imperium of Man. Thus began the Great Crusade. Great fleets departed the Sol system in shining armadas. At their head traveled vessels unlike any that had sailed the void before, vast, cathedral-like ships bearing warriors crafted through methods lost to ordinary science. These were the legions Astartes, the Space Marines, gene-forged soldiers built for endurance, loyalty, and war. They were the mailed fists of the Imperium, and they marched beside the human armies of the Imperial Army, the fleets of the Imperial Navy, and the scholars, engineers, and diplomats of a growing interstellar state. At first, progress was astonishing. World after world was rediscovered. Some greeted the Imperium with relief, recognizing long-lost kin. Others resisted, wary of outside control or fiercely protective of their independence. In those cases, compliance was achieved by force. Though the Crusade spoke of unity, it was unity on imperial terms. Yet for all its wars, there was optimism in those early years, a belief that each victory brought humanity closer to lasting peace. The Emperor himself walked among his generals and sons. His presence was described as commanding, distant, and impossible to ignore. He did not waste words, nor did he offer comfort easily. His concern was not with individual lives, but with the fate of the species as a whole. To carry out his vision, he had created more than armies. Before the Great Crusade began, the Emperor had fashioned 20 superhuman beings, the Primarchs. Each was a towering figure of immense strength, intellect, and charisma, designed to be both general and exemplar. But fate, or forces unseen, had scattered them across the galaxy as infants. The Crusade became not only a campaign of reunification for humanity, but a long search for these lost sons. One by one, they were found. Each rediscovery was a moment of legend. A warrior king ruling a feudal world, a brilliant tactician commanding a stellar empire, a grim survivor forged in the harshest conditions imaginable. Each Primarch was different, shaped by the culture that had raised him, yet all bore the unmistakable mark of the Emperor's design. When reunited with their gene sire, most pledged loyalty without hesitation. They took command of the Space Marine legions created from their genetic template. Under their leadership, the Crusade accelerated. Compliance was achieved not merely through superior arms, but through brilliance of strategy and the fierce devotion these demigods inspired. Among them all, one rose swiftly to particular prominence. Horus, charismatic, bold, and gifted with an instinctive understanding of both warfare and people, he became a symbol of the Crusade's triumphs. Soldiers trusted him. Remembrances, the artists and chroniclers sent to record the Imperium's rise, found in him a figure of rare warmth among otherwise distant commanders. Even other Primarchs, proud and powerful in their own right, often found themselves drawn into his orbit. To many, it seemed natural when the Emperor elevated him above the rest. Yet in these early days, such decisions felt like signs of strength, not seeds of doubt. The Imperium was expanding at a pace that seemed unstoppable. Warp routes stabilized under protection of Imperial fleets. Isolated worlds rejoiced at reconnection. Ancient technologies were recovered from forgotten vaults. Human populations, once divided by light years and centuries of isolation, began to think of themselves as part of a single destiny. The Emperor, however, grew increasingly distant. Where once he had led from the front, appearing in person on campaign, now he withdrew more often to Terra. There, vast works were underway, projects spoken of only in fragments and hints. Some said he sought to master the hidden pathways of the warp without reliance on mutant navigators. Others believed he labored on defenses against threats not yet revealed. Few knew the truth, and fewer still would have understood it. His absence was explained as necessity. The Crusade had grown beyond any one being, even him. The Primarchs were his generals now, and they carried his authority into the void. Outwardly, nothing faltered. Compliance followed compliance. Alien empires that had once dominated human space were driven back or destroyed. Pirate realms were shattered. Tyrants fell. On thousands of worlds, imperial banners rose over newly built fortresses and administratum hubs. Bureaucracy followed victory, weaving distant planets into a single, if unwieldy, structure. But beneath the triumphs, subtle tensions began to form. The Imperium was not a simple alliance. It was an empire of strict doctrine. Worlds were expected to abandon local faiths in favor of the imperial truth, a secular philosophy that denied gods and superstition. Technology was to be regulated. Psyches were to be controlled. Cultures that did not align with imperial standards were reshaped or erased. For many, this was a fair price for security and unity. For others, it was a quiet wound. Some Primarchs embraced the imperial truth with fervor, seeing it as a path to enlightenment. Others, shaped by deeply spiritual homeworlds, obeyed but did not fully believe. A few kept their doubts private, hidden beneath layers of discipline and duty. The Emperor did not publicly address such concerns. His communications were strategic, measured, and often brief. He did not explain every decision, nor did he invite debate. His sons were mighty, but they were still tools in service of a greater design. And so the Crusade pressed on, its momentum masking fractures too small, at first, to see. In quiet moment between campaigns, fleets drifted through starlit voids while crews rested. On observation decks, remembrances painted nebulae and wrote of heroic deeds. Astarte stood in silent vigil, armor dark against the glow of distant suns. Officers spoke in low voices of future glories, a time when the galaxy would be fully reunited, and war would become a memory rather than a constant necessity. There was confidence then, a sense that history itself moved in their favor. Few paused to consider how fragile such certainty might be. The galaxy was vast, older than humanity by spans difficult to comprehend. Beneath its beauty lay dangers not yet understood, and consequences not yet paid. Every conquered world carried its own history, its own secrets. Not all threats wore the face of open enemies. Some waited in shadows, patient and subtle. Still, in these early years, hope was a dominant note. Hope in unity. Hope in progress. Hope in the guiding hand of a distant, golden figure on Terra. And so Chapter 1 of the Imperium's great expansion unfolded like a sunrise across the stars, slow, radiant, and filled with promise. Fleets moved outward in widening arcs. The legions fought with discipline and pride. The Primarchs stood as living symbols of human potential. Above them all, unseen but ever present, the Emperor's vast design continued to take shape. For those who lived in that time, it felt as though nothing could truly go wrong. The night had been long, and dawn had finally come. Yet even the brightest dawn cast long shadows. And in the quiet between the victories, in the spaces where questions went unasked and doubts went unspoken, the first faint echoes of a future disaster began to stir. Not yet as thunder, not yet as storm, but as a distant, almost imperceptible shift in the wind among the stars. For now, however, the Crusade sailed on in confidence, wrapped in the glow of its own success, unaware how delicate that glow truly was. And in the stillness of the void, beneath the slow turning of distant galaxies, humanity dreamed of an empire that would last forever. As the Great Crusade advanced deeper into the galaxy, its early victories began to take on the quality of inevitability. What had once seemed a daring venture into the unknown gradually transformed into a measured, systematized expansion. Imperial cartographers traced glowing routes through newly stabilized warp corridors, and each successful compliance added another point of light to the growing stellar map of human dominion. The fleets moved with ritual precision. Explorative vessels of the Mechanicum ranged ahead, scanning for lost colonies and relic technologies. Diplomatic envoys followed in their wake, bearing offers of reunion under the banner of terror. Behind them came the warships, immense armored behemoths whose shadows fell across planetary skies like descending mountains. Upon their arrival, each world faced a choice, willing compliance or reluctant submission. For many planets, the decision was simple. Generations of isolation had left them vulnerable to Xenos predation, internal strife, or slow cultural decline. The Imperium's arrival promised protection, knowledge, and reconnect with a greater human family. These worlds welcomed the Aquila with ceremonies, pledges, and oaths sworn beneath unfamiliar constellations. Other worlds required persuasion of a harsher kind. In those instances, the legions of Astartes descended. To witness a legion at war was to behold a force that seemed almost mythic. Space Marines advanced through firestorms and collapsing cities with unwavering discipline. Their armor bore the heraldry of distant gene-sires, their movements coordinated with mathematical precision. They were not driven by rage alone, nor by cruelty, but by purpose, the firm belief that every battle brought humanity closer to lasting unity. Above them, Primarchs directed campaigns of astonishing complexity. Some favored rapid decapitation strikes that shattered enemy leadership within hours. Others orchestrated grand encirclements, isolating hostile forces until resistance simply dissolved. Still others preferred prolonged demonstrations of overwhelming strength, breaking the will of opponents without reducing entire worlds to ruin. Each Primarch expressed war as an extension of his own nature, and the diversity of their approaches gave the Crusade a flexibility no foe could easily counter. Records from this era speak often of cooperation between legions. Joint operations became common as expeditionary fleets grew larger. Warriors from different genetic lineages fought side by side, their varied doctrines blending into formidable combined strategies. Bonds formed in these shared campaigns, rivalries, certainly, but also respect. The Primarchs, when gathered together, debated tactics and philosophy in councils that could reshape the course of entire sectors. At the heart of it all remained a shared conviction. They were building something permanent. On compliant worlds, reconstruction followed swiftly after conquest. Administrative officials established governance structures aligned with imperial law. The Mechanicum restored or replaced damaged infrastructure. Astropathic choirs linked planets into a vast communication web, while navigators charted safer passages through the warp. Trade resumed along routes that had lain dormant for centuries. For ordinary humans, the changes were profound. Isolation gave way to awareness of a greater whole. Stories spread of distant terror, of the emperor who had ended old night, and of the towering warriors who served as his angels of conquest. In many places, the imperial truth was taught in newly founded academies, a doctrine of reason, progress, and the rejection of superstition. Though not all accepted it easily, its promise of a future shaped by human will rather than fear held undeniable appeal. Yet the scale of the crusade also brought distance. The emperor was now a figure encountered mostly through symbol and decree. His presence, once felt directly on campaign, became something abstract, a guiding authority whose words arrived across light years, formal and carefully measured. To many citizens, he was already becoming more legend than man, a remote architect of destiny whose plans stretched beyond individual understanding. Among the Primarchs, responsibility grew heavier. Each commanded not only armies, but entire regions of expanding space. They negotiated with planetary rulers, oversaw compliance terms, and balanced the demands of relentless advance with the need to secure what had already been won. Some bore this burden with outward calm. Others felt the strain in ways they did not openly voice. Still, the Crusade's momentum allowed little time for reflection. New threats emerged as humanity pushed into regions long dominated by alien powers. Some Xeno civilizations were ancient, their technologies refined by epochs of uninterrupted development. Campaigns against such foes were costly, and even the Legion could not claim victory without sacrifice. Ships were lost. Veteran warriors fell. Entire regiments of the Imperial Army vanished in distant systems whose names were later recorded only in memorial rolls. These losses were accepted as necessary. The vision of a unified human galaxy was so vast, so compelling that individual tragedies seemed small by comparison. Each fallen soldier was honored, each destroyed world marked as a lesson. The crusade pressed forward, driven by the belief that hardship in the present would secure peace for untold generations to come. And yet, in subtle ways, the character of the Imperium was changing. What began as a mission of reunification was becoming an empire of immense complexity. Layers of bureaucracy accumulated. Military commanders sometimes found themselves waiting on distant approvals. Cultural differences between compliant worlds required constant negotiation. The simple clarity of early campaigns gave way to the intricate management of a civilization spread across thousands of systems. For the Astartes, created for war, prolonged governance felt unfamiliar. They were conquerors, not administrators. While some Primarchs adapted readily to the political dimensions of rule, others grew restless, eager to return to the direct clarity of battle. In private councils, discussions occasionally turned to how long the crusade would truly last, and what role the legions would serve once the galaxies stood united. No clear answers emerged. Such questions drifted like faint signals at the edge of perception, acknowledged, then set aside in favor of immediate duties. There were always more stars ahead, more lost colonies to find, more enemies to defeat. The future could be considered later, once the work was done. So the fleets continued their patient advance, engines humming like distant thunder in the void. Worlds rose into compliance behind them, while uncharted regions waited in silence before them. The Imperium's light spread wider with each passing year, bright enough to dazzle those who stood within it. But even the brightest light, cast across so vast a darkness, could not reveal every shape that moved beyond its reach. And as the crusade sailed onward through the deepening night of the galaxy, its triumph shone brilliantly, while the first true test of its unity drew, slowly and quietly, closer. In the measured rhythm of the Great Crusade, there were periods when the advance slowed, not from defeat, but from consolidation. Vast distances separated newly compliant systems, and even the Imperium's formidable fleets required time to weave these far-flung worlds into something resembling coherence. It was during these quieter intervals that subtler currents began to move beneath the surface of victory. Across expeditionary armadas, routines formed. Astartes drilled in cavernous training holds while their warships translated between systems. Imperial army regiments rotated from frontline duty to occupation roles, patrolling cities that only months earlier had been battlegrounds. Remembrances continued their wake, documenting not only triumphs, but the daily life of a crusade that had become, in many ways, a traveling civilization. Within this vast, mobile society, perceptions of the Imperium began to diverge. To the ordinary human soldier or administrator, the crusade was a mission of liberation and order. Each world brought into compliance represented safety for countless others. Trade routes reopened. Piracy declined. Astropathic messages flowed more freely with every stabilized corridor. The Imperium seemed a rising tide that lifted humanity out of centuries of fragmentation. For the legions of Astartes, the view was more complex. They had been created for a singular purpose, to conquer in the Emperor's name. Yet conquest was no longer the only task before them. Garrisons were established on newly compliant worlds, sometimes for years at a time. Detachments oversaw reconstruction efforts or enforced doctrinal changes mandated by imperial authorities. Though these duties were carried out with discipline, they did not always align with the warrior's innate drive for decisive action. Some legions adapted by cultivating strong ties with the worlds they protected, becoming symbols of stability as much as instruments of war. Others maintained a deliberate distance, seeing prolonged occupation as a distraction from the greater mission still unfolding among the stars. The Primarchs, too, felt the shifting balance. Their councils grew more frequent, often conducted across vast distances through astropathic relay and encoded transmissions. Matters once settled by battlefield instinct now required negotiation with civilian branches of the expanding Imperium. Questions of resource allocation, compliance standards, and long-term governance demanded attention alongside strategy and logistics. In these exchanges, differences in temperament became more pronounced. Certain Primarchs spoke passionately of the imperial truth, urging stricter enforcement to ensure that superstition and local cults did not take root again. Others counseled patience, arguing that cultural transformation required time and subtlety. Though such disagreements rarely escalated into open conflict, they revealed that unity, while strong, was not absolute uniformity. Above all, there lingered the quiet reality of the Emperor's continued absence from the front lines. His directives still guided the crusade, arriving with unquestionable authority, yet they often addressed outcomes rather than explanations. Grand strategies were issued without the reasoning behind them. Entire sectors were prioritized or deprioritized according to calculations known only to him. To most, this was simply the nature of command at such a scale. To a few, it was a source of unspoken uncertainty, not doubt in his purpose, but in their own understanding of it. Among the fleets, rumors occasionally circulated, never officially acknowledged, of immense undertakings underway on Terra, vast construction efforts, secretive research, projects that required the Emperor's personal oversight. These whispers were treated with a mixture of pride and distance. Pride that such works existed, distance because they were beyond the reach of even the Primarchs' knowledge. Meanwhile, the galaxy itself offered reminders that it was not an empty stage awaiting human dominion. Explorator missions encountered regions where warp space behaved unpredictably, despite careful charting. Some systems displayed signs of long-dead civilizations whose ruins defied easy explanation. Others bore evidence of recent, inexplicable devastation. Cities abandoned without signs of conventional warfare, orbital stations drifting lifeless around intact worlds. Such discoveries were catalogued, investigated where feasible, and often left behind as the crusade pressed on. There were always more urgent objectives ahead, and the Imperium's resources, though vast, were not infinite. Yet each anomaly added a quiet note of caution to the symphony of expansion. Within the legions, this manifested as a growing emphasis on preparedness. Training intensified in certain formations. Librarians, those Astartes gifted with psychic ability, were monitored with renewed care as the Imperium sought to balance the utility of their powers against the ever-present risks of the warp. Chaplains reinforced loyalty and unity, not because it was failing, but because its preservation was considered paramount. Outwardly, morale remained high. Victories continued. New Primarch-led campaigns pushed into previously unreachable regions. Imperial banners rose over fortress worlds and orbital shipyards that would sustain future advances. To an observer measuring only territory gained and enemies defeated, the crusade appeared stronger than ever. But strength, in such a vast endeavor, was not a single quality. It was a tapestry woven from trust, purpose, communication, and shared belief. And while no thread had yet snapped, some had begun to pull under the strain of distance, responsibility, and unspoken questions. In quiet moments aboard their flagships, Primarchs studied star charts that seemed to expand faster than they could be secured. They considered brothers leading campaigns half a galaxy away, each interpreting the Emperor's will through the lens of his own experience. They bore the weight of millions of lives, and the knowledge that their decisions would echo across centuries. Still, none imagined that the greatest threat to their unity might arise not from alien empires or hostile realms, but from the very scale of the dream they served. For now, the crusade endured in confidence. Its fleets moved like constellations in motion, bright against the dark. Its warriors stood vigilant, certain of their purpose. Its leaders pressed forward, guided by a vision that seemed both noble and unassailable. And beneath it all, like a distant vibration too low to be heard, the first true tremors of an unseen calamity continued to gather, patient, subtle, and drawing ever closer as humanity's empire stretched itself across the stars. The Great Crusade continued, a tide of human ambition sweeping ever outward into the galaxy. Yet even amid victories that seemed unassailable, the subtle weight of history and distance began to press upon the Imperium. The achievements of the early campaigns were vast and undeniable. Thousands of worlds rediscovered, billions of souls reunited, and the scattered remnants of lost civilizations brought under single banner. Yet these triumphs carried within them small, nearly imperceptible fractures, tensions that could only grow in the long years to come. In the legions, there was a sense of both pride and quiet unease. Each space marine, bound to his gene sire, moved with precision and certainty. Yet even among these engineered warriors, patterns of caution began to emerge. Campaigns no longer relied solely upon the overwhelming might of the legions, logistical coordination, administrative oversight, and the management of civilian populations demanded constant attention. The simplicity of battle had given way to the complexity of empire. On distant worlds, the process of integration into the Imperium required more than martial dominance. Administrators, scholars, and engineers labored to enforce the imperial truth, to rebuild infrastructure, and to reshape local governance to reflect the principles of unity, order, and reason. Some worlds adapted willingly, finding purpose and connection to a greater human whole. Others conformed grudgingly, hiding resistance beneath layers of feigned compliance. In every case, the subtle interplay of local tradition and imperial expectation created a tension that was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Primarchs, each a living symbol of the Emperor's vision, observed these shifts with differing perspectives. Some raised upon worlds of discipline and order, saw resistance as a temporary obstacle to be overcome with patience, guidance, or force as necessary. Others, whose formative years had been shaped by chaos and hardship, recognized the fragility of loyalty and the risk of complacency even amidst widespread obedience. Private councils among the Primarchs often reflected these diverging philosophies, though disagreements were tempered by the knowledge that the crusade depended upon mutual cooperation above all else. Horus, as the first among equals, remained a figure of particular note. His presence inspired confidence, not only in those who served under him but also among his peers. He possessed a rare combination of instinct, strategy, and empathy that allowed him to navigate both the battlefield and the intricate politics of the crusade. Yet even he, for all his skill, sensed the subtle unease rippling through the legions. The weight of expectation, the enormity of the Emperor's plan, and the growing autonomy of worlds newly integrated into the Imperium created an undercurrent that no strategist, no matter how gifted, could entirely master. The Emperor, still distant and largely absent from the front lines, continued his work on Terra, overseeing projects and schemes whose full purpose remained beyond the understanding of any mortal, including his Primarchs. His decisions were absolute, communicated through brief missives and directives that shaped the course of the crusade in ways both immediate and far-reaching. Yet this absence, while necessary for the execution of his vision, introduced a subtle void in the direct guidance once provided to the legions. Commanders were empowered, yet they were also left to interpret intent, a task that relied upon trust, intuition, and the quiet assumption that all decisions were made in alignment with the Emperor's unknowable design. Amid the glow of victory, the galaxy itself began to remind humanity that it was not a blank canvas upon which only the Imperium could write its story. Explorative fleets encountered planets scarred by ancient conflicts, where ruins whispered of civilizations destroyed by forces beyond comprehension. Warp anomalies disrupted navigation, swallowing ships or sending them to unknown reaches. Isolated encounters with Xenos, whether hostile or enigmatic, revealed technologies and mindsets that defied imperial categorization. These discoveries, catalogued and studied, underscored the vastness of the universe and the limits of human understanding, even as the crusade pressed onward. The Imperium's triumphs were celebrated with ceremonies, memorials, and oaths, yet shadows grew longer with each passing campaign. For every world that welcomed the Emperor's banner, there were those whose compliance was fragile, whose allegiance was conditional, or whose traditions lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the first lapse in oversight. And though such concerns were often dismissed in favor of immediate expansion, their presence created subtle ripples, small deviations that would, over time, amplify into consequences far beyond any individual campaign. Within the legions themselves, these pressures were manifested as increasing vigilance. Chaplains reinforced doctrine, reminding Space Marines that their loyalty was not merely to conquest, but to the preservation of humanity's unity and purity of purpose. Librarians, both revered and feared, were monitored carefully as their mastery of the warp, though a tool of great utility, could also pose unforeseen risks. Training, patrols, and ceremonial observances consumed hours, days, and weeks, reinforcing discipline while subtly emphasizing the weight of responsibility each warrior bore. And yet, amid these tensions, there remained a pervasive sense of optimism. Humanity's reconnect with itself was unprecedented. The Imperium, vast and imposing, moved like a living organism, its growth unceasing, its ambition seemingly limitless. Star systems that had once languished in isolation now contributed to a greater whole. Technologies, long thought lost, were recovered and applied to advance the Crusade's reach. Military victories were frequent, and each success reinforced confidence, both within the legions and among the populations they served. Even as a shadow of subtle unease stretched across the expanding empire, the Crusade's leaders pressed forward, motivated by a vision that was as much philosophical as strategic, the belief that humanity could rise above its past, that scattered worlds would become a unified civilization, and that the Emperor's design would endure. Yet in the quiet corners of distant starships, in the hushed reflections of those who served closest to the Emperor's sons, there lingered the unspoken, understanding that greatness carried risk beyond immediate perception. The galaxy, vast and ancient, was patient. Its dangers were often invisible, its lessons delayed. And though the Great Crusade shone like a golden light against the darkness, even the brightest illumination cannot entirely dispel the gathering shadows. Thus, the Imperium moved forward, brilliant, disciplined, and unyielding, yet unknowingly poised at the cusp of trials that would test the very foundations of its unity. And in that calm before the storm, as fleets traced luminous paths among distant suns and warriors trained beneath alien skies, a quiet sense of inevitability lingered, an understanding that the Golden Age, for all its brilliance, was not without its unseen perils. The Crusade advanced, the legions marched, and humanity dreamed of a galaxy bound in order. Yet even in triumph, the first whispers of unforeseen disaster drifted across the void, subtle, patient, and waiting for the moment when certainty would falter. By the time the Great Crusade reached its greatest breadth, spanning countless systems and innumerable star clusters, the Imperium had become a structure of almost incomprehensible complexity. Every victory, every recovered world, every subjugated system added layers of responsibility that stretched from the Emperor's distant throne on Terra to the smallest frontier garrison. It was a galaxy being slowly, inexorably shaped in accordance with a vision that was vast, patient, and, for most who served it, beyond full understanding. The fleets themselves had grown monumental. Ships of light and shadow glided through warped corridors, carrying thousands of soldiers, civilians, and support personnel. On board, legions of starts trained tirelessly, their drills combining martial skill, discipline, and ritual in ways that bound mind, body, and purpose. Yet even in such rigorous order, there were moments when the vastness of their undertaking became clear. They were not merely conquerors, they were guardians, administrators, and symbols of an empire in the making. Primarchs carried these responsibilities with differing degrees of weight. Each was a reflection of the Emperor's design, yet shaped by the circumstances of their upbringing. Some ruled with a measured hand, balancing the demands of governance with the imperatives of conquest. Others were more direct, relying on sheer force and the devotion of their warriors to achieve compliance. Yet all were aware, in some quiet moment, that the galaxy offered no guarantees and that the smallest misstep could reverberate across light years and centuries alike. Horus, as War Master and first among equals, bore the greatest scrutiny. His successes inspired confidence not only in the soldiers under his command, but also among the other Primarchs. They recognized in him a combination of intellect, intuition, and charisma that allowed him to unify disparate forces and manage complexities that might have overwhelmed lesser leaders. And yet, even he could not fully account for every variable. The subtle discontent of distant worlds, the hidden motives of administrators, the unpredictable nature of warp travel, or the mysterious influence of powers that lay beyond human perception. Amid the expansion, subtle patterns began to emerge on the fringes of human-controlled space. Worlds once thriving now displayed signs of hidden strife, economies disrupted, cultural traditions suppressed, local leaders quietly resentful. These were rarely overt threats, but they reminded those who observed them that unity required constant attention, not only in law and fleet movements, but in the management of human hearts and minds. The Imperium was not simply a military machine. It was a civilization in its formative stages, fragile in ways not always visible from the vantage of conquest. Within the legions, this awareness influenced both training and discipline. Chaplains reinforced the importance of loyalty, reminding Space Marines that their duty extended beyond the battlefield to the spiritual and ideological cohesion of the Imperium. Librarians studied the warp with ever greater care, balancing the need for insight with the risk inherent in its use. Even the simplest patrol could become a test of judgment, demanding that warriors act not only with strength but with wisdom, patience, and restraint. Yet despite these pressures, the Crusade retained its outward brilliance. Worlds were stabilized with remarkable efficiency. Administrators implemented systems for governance, trade, and defense. The Mechanicum restored and enhanced lost technologies, building infrastructure to support both fleet operations and planetary populations. Star systems long isolated from each other began to feel the quiet hum of interconnection as astropaths transmitted messages that had not been possible for centuries. The Imperium, in many ways, seemed invincible. This appearance, however, belied the complexity underlying every decision. Every expansion brought new variables, alien species whose motives were uncertain, resources that were finite, populations with customs resistant to impose order. Even among the Primarchs, disagreements occasionally surfaced. Some advocated rapid enforcement of imperial doctrine, believing that absolute compliance was necessary for stability. Others counseled patience, cautioning that premature enforcement could generate resentment, rebellion, or loss of control. These discussions, though conducted privately and with care, underscore that even in a time of seeming triumph, the Imperium's structure was delicately balanced. The Emperor, though still remote, remained the guiding force. His directives shaped campaigns across thousands of systems, each instruction precise and absolute. Yet in his absence, decisions fell increasingly to mortal hands, requiring judgment, foresight, and trust. The Primarchs, powerful though they were, recognized the responsibility inherent in interpreting a vision so immense. Every choice carried consequences, some immediate, others only observable in decades or centuries. Even amidst victories, losses reminded the Crusade of the galaxy's unpredictability. Entire regiments of the Imperial army could be lost to warp anomalies or hidden Xenos threats. Worlds sometimes fell into chaos despite careful governance, necessitating renewed intervention. And while these events did not threaten the Crusade's overall momentum, they introduced subtle strains that demanded vigilance, planning, and resilience. For ordinary humans, life under the expanding Imperium was a mixture of hope and adjustment. Worlds that had once been isolated, fractured, or oppressed were given the promise of order, protection, and technological renewal. Trade and communication expanded, linking populations that had not seen one another for generations. Cultural and religious traditions were often reshaped or suppressed in favor of the imperial truth, a process that brought both stability and quiet tension. People learned to exist within the framework of a civilization larger than they could fully comprehend, reliant on the distant guidance of an emperor whose presence was often felt rather than seen. As the crusade pressed forward, the distance between the emperor and his legions grew, yet his vision remained the central axis around which all actions revolved. The Imperium moved as a single organism, yet within that movement were countless microcosms of uncertainty, individual decisions, unforeseen circumstances, subtle dissonances that, if left unaddressed, could expand into consequences beyond the immediate horizon. And so, the galaxy advanced under the twin forces of triumph and vigilance. The Crusade's light shone ever brighter, yet the shadows in its wake lengthened imperceptibly. The achievements of the Imperium were monumental, yet their preservation required constant attention, foresight, and sacrifice. Every fleet, every legion, every Primarch contributed to the shaping of a civilization that was at once brilliant and fragile, glorious and delicately poised. In these moments, the first faint hints of a larger, more profound challenge could be felt, not as a roar or storm, but as a subtle tremor beneath the steady march of progress. The Imperium had achieved more than any previous human endeavor, yet the galaxy remained vast, ancient, and indifferent. Even in triumph, the seeds of unforeseen disaster had begun their slow, inevitable growth, imperceptible to all but the patient and the observant. And so, the Great Crusade continued its golden expansion, triumphant yet quietly shadowed, moving ever outward into the vast, mysterious reaches of the galaxy, unaware that the first true trials of its unity and vision were drawing steadily closer, patient as the stars themselves. As the Great Crusade pressed deeper into the uncharted regions of the galaxy, the Imperium's outward appearance of unity and order grew ever more dazzling. Yet beneath the surface, subtle currents of tension and unease began to ripple through its vast framework. The victories of the early campaigns, though numerous and celebrated, had created a structure of such scale that even minor divergences in loyalty, interpretation, or temperament could reverberate far beyond their point of origin. In this era, long before the storm that would later fracture the legions, the first faint whispers of discord began to stir. Primarchs, the living extensions of the Emperor's vision, were not immune to these pressures. Each had been shaped by circumstance, by the worlds upon which they were raised, and by the experiences that had forged them long before they were reunited with their father. Their power, influence, and authority were unparalleled. Yet even they were constrained by the complexity of command over thousands of worlds, millions of soldiers, and the infinite variables of human behavior. What had once been straightforward conquest now demanded diplomacy, judgment, and the constant interpretation of the Emperor's distant directives. Horus, already recognized as a war master and first among equals, bore particular weight. His victories were many, his counsel sought by Primarchs and governors alike. Yet even he, for all his skill and charisma, could sense the subtle unease growing across the Imperium. Worlds that once welcomed imperial guidance now exhibited signs of latent discontent, minor rebellions, or quiet resistance. Administrators reported compliance, yet the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of habit, tradition, and the silent calculation of populations unaccustomed to sudden subjugation. It was in these moments that the scale of the Imperium became apparent, not as a machine of absolute certainty, but as a living, imperfect organism, sprawling across the stars and composed of countless interacting parts. Fleet commanders found themselves navigating not only hostile space but also the intricate politics of human worlds. Space Marines were tasked not only with combat but with oversight, guidance, and sometimes subtle coercion to ensure loyalty remained intact. Even the Primarchs, in their exceptional clarity of purpose, were required to weigh outcomes carefully, balancing immediate success with long-term stability. Amid this complexity, differences of temperament and philosophy began to emerge more clearly. Some Primarchs emphasized strict adherence to the imperial truth, believing that unity required uniformity of belief and practice. Others counseled patience, recognizing that cultures formed over millennia could not be reshaped overnight, and that force without understanding might produce only temporary compliance. These debates, largely conducted in private and often mediated through subtle gestures and counsel rather than open argument, reflected the growing awareness that victory in battle alone would not secure the Imperium's lasting stability. Even as these tensions unfolded, the galaxy itself reminded humanity of its vastness and unpredictability. Warp anomalies disrupted established routes, scattering fleets or delaying vital reinforcements. Long-dead civilizations revealed relics of technology and influence beyond human comprehension. Encounters with alien species, whether hostile, neutral, or enigmatic, demanded caution, innovation, and sometimes restraint. Each unexpected event emphasized that despite the brilliance of the Crusade, the universe remained indifferent to human ambition. Within the legions, these pressures manifested in subtle ways. Warriors, disciplined and unwavering, trained and fought with relentless dedication, yet the quieter burdens of governance and oversight introduced moments of reflection rarely acknowledged outside their ranks. Chaplains reinforced loyalty, reminding their brethren that devotion to the Emperor and the Crusade extended beyond acts of combat. Librarians exercised caution with the warp, understanding that insight was a double-edged instrument capable of revealing both opportunity and danger. Even minor lapses in discipline, though rare, were noted and corrected with a precision that reinforced both order and awareness. Among ordinary humans, the expansion of the Imperium brought both hope and adjustment. Worlds once isolated or fractured were offered protection, stability, and access to advanced technologies. Trade, communication, and governance flourished, yet cultural traditions and local beliefs were often reshaped or suppressed. The process of integration, though outwardly peaceful and methodical, produced subtle frictions, small disturbances in loyalty that often went unnoticed until amplified by circumstance. These undercurrents, like ripples across a calm surface, would in time contribute to the shaping of events far beyond their immediate origin. Despite these challenges, the outward momentum of the Crusade remained extraordinary. Star systems fell into line, fleets moved with precision, and the legions executed campaigns that were both brilliant and decisive. The Emperor's vision, though distant, was manifest in every recovered world, every stabilized sector, and every soldier who pledged loyalty to his cause. Yet the necessity of human judgment in interpreting his will introduce variations in execution, subtle deviations that could never be entirely reconciled. Even the greatest successes carried a quiet acknowledgement that perfection in such a vast endeavor was unattainable. And so, beneath the shining veneer of triumph, faint tremors of dissonance gathered. They were not yet crises, not yet overt signs of collapse, but they were persistent and growing. Differences of philosophy among the Primarchs, cultural tensions on distant worlds, the unpredictable forces of the warp, and the inherent imperfection of Human governance combined into a network of potential instability. In isolation, each was minor. Together, they formed a pattern that only hindsight would recognize as the first true echoes of the disaster yet to come. For now, however, the crusade continued. Fleets traced courses through the stars, legions executed campaigns with precision, and humanity's light spread ever outward into the void. The Imperium's achievements were monumental, and its promise seemed without limit. Yet even as the stars themselves glittered with a reflection of imperial banners, the galaxy waited, patient and eternal, its vast silence a subtle reminder that even in an age of boundless triumph, shadow and consequence moved unseen, quietly shaping the destiny of all who called themselves human. And in that quiet, stretching across countless light years, the first seeds of discord took root, imperceptible yet persistent, marking the beginning of a subtle unraveling that would, in time, challenge the unity and purpose of the legions and the very vision of the Emperor himself. By the time the Great Crusade had reached the outer fringes of known human space, the Imperium had grown into a sprawling construct of extraordinary reach, encompassing thousands of star systems and billions of souls. Each new conquest brought triumph, yet each also carried unseen consequences, subtle and cumulative, that demanded careful attention from the Primarchs, the fleets, and the administrators who sought to impose order upon worlds both newly discovered and long neglected. The galaxy, vast and indifferent, remained ever present in the background, its enormity reminding humanity that even its greatest achievements were but small lights against the darkness. In the legions, discipline and loyalty remained absolute, yet cracks began to appear, faint at first, in the form of differing approaches to command, the prioritization of objectives, and the interpretation of the Emperor's distant will. Some Primarchs favored swift and uncompromising enforcement of imperial doctrine, believing that clarity of purpose would forestall dissent and preserve order. Others advocated a measured approach, recognizing that cultural traditions and long-held beliefs could not be erased without careful negotiation and subtle persuasion. These philosophical differences, though largely concealed beneath layers of respect and camaraderie, introduced friction into councils and planning sessions where once there had been near unanimity. Horus, as War Master, continued to act as a central point of unity. His presence inspired confidence, and his judgment was trusted by both his peers and the Imperial command. Yet even he sensed a slow accumulation of strain across the legions. Worlds that had initially complied with minimal resistance sometimes demonstrated small, seemingly inconsequential acts of defiance. Administrators reported anomalies in loyalty and efficiency. Even in the disciplined ranks of the estates, subtle tensions arose, occasionally manifesting as disagreements over the appropriate method of pacification or oversight. These were not crises in themselves, but their persistence and pattern suggested that the foundations of the Crusade, though vast and formidable, were not immune to challenge. Meanwhile, the Emperor remained remote, his attention focused on projects and undertakings on terror whose magnitude was beyond the comprehension of even his most trusted sons. Vast works, both practical and arcane, occupied his focus, leaving the Primarchs and their commanders to interpret his strategic intent across the galaxy. Orders arrived with clarity of purpose, yet rarely contained explanation for rationale or foresight into their consequences. This delegation of authority, though necessary, introduced the inevitability of human judgment into the execution of a vision that was otherwise superhuman in scale. As the Imperium expanded, the galaxy itself reminded humanity of its complexity and unpredictability. Explorator fleets reported warp anomalies, mysterious ruins of civilizations far older than human memory, and Xenos presences whose motives could not be fully discerned. These discoveries were catalogued, studied, and often left unresolved, as the Crusade's momentum allowed no pause for complete comprehension. Each anomaly represented not only a challenge to Imperial strategy, but also a subtle reminder that the universe was neither obedient nor comprehensible in its entirety. Within the legions, this awareness shaped conduct and discipline. Chaplains reinforced doctrine with increased rigor, emphasizing the necessity of loyalty and vigilance. Librarians monitored the warp carefully, aware that insight carried risk as well as benefit. Training regimens were intensified, not only for battlefield readiness but for endurance in governance, oversight, and the management of populations whose allegiance was often conditional. Even minor lapses were addressed rigorously, as the Imperium could not tolerate disorder, however subtle, within its ranks. Ordinary humans under the banner of the Imperium experienced both hope and constraint. Worlds once isolated or fractured were incorporated into an expansive network of governance, communication, and trade. Technologies long thought lost were restored, allowing societies to flourish in ways unimaginable to their ancestors. Yet the imposition of the imperial truth, while offering stability, also required the suppression or adaptation of local culture, religion, and practice. Compliance was often outwardly complete, but beneath the surface, currents of quiet resistance persisted, imperceptible but persistent, like a soft wind stirring in the undergrowth. Amid these developments, the Primarchs convened more frequently in private councils. Though unity remained, subtle disagreements regarding strategy, governance, and doctrine grew more pronounced. Some argue for the strict enforcement of the Emperor's vision, believing that clarity and uniformity were essential to long-term stability. Others counseled caution, suggesting that imposition without consideration of human and planetary nuance could generate unrest over time. These discussions, though discreet, signaled the first acknowledgement that absolute control over the galaxy, no matter how brilliant the crusade, was an aspiration that required continual vigilance and adaptation. Despite these pressures, the outward appearances of the crusade remained radiant. Fleets moved in precise formation across warp and real space, conquering, stabilizing, and linking systems with breathtaking efficiency. The legions executed campaigns with skill and discipline that bordered on legend. Administrators and Mechanicum forces restored lost technologies and rebuilt infrastructure, reinforcing the growing reach of the Imperium. To most observers, the Crusade seemed unstoppable, a shining testament to the Emperor's vision and the effectiveness of his sons. Yet beneath this brilliance, the first true whispers of disaster began to gather, not as overt acts of rebellion, nor as sudden catastrophe, but as a persistent sense that the Imperium's scale, complexity, and dependence upon human judgment introduced vulnerabilities that had yet to manifest in full. Small tensions, differences in interpretation, and unacknowledged discontent moved silently across the galaxy, imperceptible amid the grandeur of conquest, yet inevitable in their cumulative effect. And so, the crusade pressed onward, vast and triumphant, its fleets tracing luminous arcs across the stars. The legions remained disciplined, the Primarchs vigilant, and the Emperor's distant vision continued to guide their movements. Yet even in this golden age, subtle shadows gathered in the margins, whispering of challenges yet unseen and consequences yet unmeasured, reminding all who serve that even the brightest dawn casts its own long and patient shadows across the galaxy. The stage was set. The Imperium's triumph was at its height, yet the forces of unforeseen consequence and the slow, inexorable pressure of hidden tensions were gathering like clouds on the horizon. And in that quiet accumulation, the first notes of a disaster that would change the fate of the legions waited patiently, unseen but inevitable, poised to test the very foundations upon which the crusade had been built. By the later stages of the Great Crusade, humanity's presence in the galaxy had become vast, luminous, and seemingly unassailable. Worlds that had once existed in isolation, governed by fear, superstition, or the influence of alien dominions, were now linked through fleets, warp communication, and governance under the Imperium. The Imperium's reach was impressive, its structure monumental, and its purpose clear, to unify all human civilization under the guiding hand of the Emperor. Yet even in this golden age of expansion, subtle imperfections and small, persistent doubts began to grow in corners that were often unseen, unspoken, and easily overlooked. The Primarchs, each a paragon of martial prowess and leadership, felt these pressures differently. Some, tempered by upbringing on worlds of order and discipline, approached the challenges of integration with a strict adherence to doctrine, believing that absolute compliance was the most reliable path to unity. Others, forged on harsher, more chaotic worlds, recognized that loyalty could not always be dictated by force or decree. They observed the complexity of human nature, the variance of local culture, and the persistence of beliefs that the crusade could not entirely raise. These subtle divergences of philosophy, while rarely acknowledged openly, created an undercurrent of tension among the Emperor's sons, hinting at the fragile balance upon which the vast edifice of the Imperium rested. Horus, already elevated as war master and first among equals, remained a figure of stabilizing influence. His charisma, judgment, and capacity for foresight earned the trust of the other Primarchs and the countless officers who followed his campaigns. Yet even he was aware that the scale of the crusade introduced variables that could not always be controlled. Worlds that appeared compliant could harbor latent resistance. Administrators, loyal though they appeared, sometimes interpreted imperial mandates in unexpected ways. And the warp itself, a medium ever unstable, introduced anomalies and dangers that no calculation could fully predict. It was during this era of expansion that small divergences began to carry greater weight. Fleet movement were executed with precision, yet each detachment represented a delicate balance of resources, timing, and oversight. Armies that had once fought only for conquest now assumed roles as governors, mediators, and symbols of order. The legions, Astartes, though superhuman in every respect, were tasked with responsibilities that extended beyond the battlefield. They maintained discipline, enforced law, and monitored loyalty. Each of these duties, seemingly straightforward, introduced subtle judgments that could ripple across entire sectors, shaping perceptions and outcomes in ways impossible to fully anticipate. On newly compliant worlds, the presence of the Imperium produced both or an adjustment. Populations accustomed to isolation or oppression adapted to new governance, yet cultural friction often persisted beneath the surface. The imperial truth, though presented as a doctrine of reason and enlightenment, clashed with long-standing beliefs requiring careful reinforcement by chaplains, administrators, and the Primarchs themselves. Even minor lapses in understanding or compliance, while inconsequential in isolation, could accumulate into challenges whose magnitude would only become apparent over decades or generations. The Emperor, distant and largely removed from frontline operations, remained the unifying principle of the Crusade. His directives, delivered with clarity and absolute authority, guided the expansion of the Imperium across countless systems. Yet this very distance introduced its own challenges. The Primarchs and commanders were required to interpret intent and exercise judgment in the absence of constant oversight. In most cases, this system functioned effectively. In others, subtle misalignments between vision and execution began to emerge, imperceptible in the moment but consequential over time. Amid these complexities, the galaxy itself demonstrated its indifference to human ambition. Warp storms disrupted communications and travel, scattering fleets or delaying reinforcements. Relics of ancient civilizations hinted at knowledge beyond human comprehension, while encounters with alien races revealed intelligence, resilience, and technologies that could challenge even the greatest human strategies. Each discovery, catalogued and studied, underscored the limits of human understanding, emphasizing that despite the Crusade's brilliance, the universe remained a vast, unpredictable force that would not yield entirely to any mortal design. Within the legions, these pressures influenced both action and thought. Warriors trained relentlessly, not only in combat, but in vigilance, governance, and judgment. Chaplains reinforced loyalty and unity. Librarians studied the warp with care, and leaders exercised caution in interpreting the Emperor's will. Even minor disagreements or philosophical differences between Primarchs or subordinate commanders carried potential consequences, creating subtle currents of uncertainty beneath the surface of the Imperium's outward order. As the Crusade continued, victories remained frequent and visible, reinforcing confidence in both the Imperium and its leaders. Yet subtle doubts, rarely expressed, began to coalesce. The scale of the Empire, the distance between the Emperor and his sons, and the unpredictable variables of human nature and the warp produced a sense that not all was as absolute as it seemed. These seeds of doubt were quiet, patient, and largely unremarkable in isolation. Yet their cumulative presence marked the first faint tremors of a greater instability, a foreshadowing of the trials that would challenge the unity of the legions and the very vision of the Emperor himself. In the silent void between stars, the Imperium appeared unstoppable. Fleets moved like constellations, legions enforced law and order, and worlds prospered under the guidance of human rule. The Emperor's vision, though distant, remained absolute, and humanity's triumph seemed assured. Yet even as the golden light of expansion spread across countless systems, the first subtle shadows of discord crept into the foundations of the Crusade. These shadows were imperceptible to all but the most observant, yet their presence was real, persistent, and patient. Like a faint wind stirring the surface of a still ocean, they hinted at the fragility underlying apparent certainty. The golden age of the Imperium, radiant and triumphant though it appeared, carried within it the quiet potential for upheaval. And as the Great Crusade continued, sweeping outward into the vast unknown, the first true stirrings of disaster were already taking root, invisible yet inevitable, shaping a future that would test loyalty, resolve, and unity of the legions themselves. As the Great Crusade stretched deeper into the uncharted regions of the galaxy, the Imperium's dominion seemed at its zenith. Worlds long separated by distance and circumstance now fell under the banner of the Emperor, and fleets moved in a pattern of meticulous precision, tracing paths through warp and real space alike. Yet even as victory illuminated distant systems and brought stability to billions of lives, the subtle undercurrents of unease continued to grow. These were not overt threats, no open rebellions, but quiet fractures, small deviations in loyalty, philosophy, and interpretation that, though easily ignored, foreshadowed the trials yet to come. The Primarchs, each a unique reflection of the Emperor's design, began to encounter these pressures in ways that varied according to temperament and upbringing. Some, raised in a world governed by strict order and discipline, interpreted deviation as a risk to unity and responded with rigorous oversight and enforcement. Others, shaped by environments of challenge, adversity, or chaos, recognized the nuances of human behavior, seeing loyalty not as a matter of command alone, but as something cultivated, observed, and occasionally tempered with restraint. These differing perspectives, though largely unspoken, created subtle tension within councils and among leaders whose cooperation had previously seemed unshakable. Horus, as War Master and first among equals, maintained a stabilizing presence. His authority, charisma, and judgment were widely respected, both among his peers and the officers under his command. Yet even he could sense the quiet accumulation of uncertainty, subtle and pervasive, within the sprawling reaches of the Imperium. Worlds that once complied without question began to reveal minor signs of dissonance, administrative reports that implied inefficiency, cultural resistance that was superficially concealed, and occasional lapses in the morale of populations long assumed loyal. To Horus, these were small, almost imperceptible, yet he understood that in a construct so vast, minor anomalies could grow into consequences of staggering magnitude if left unchecked. The Emperor remained distant, his focus fixed upon projects and undertakings on terror whose scope defied comprehension. His instructions, precise and absolute, guided the crusade across innumerable systems, yet his absence required the Primarchs to act with judgment, insight, and interpretation. Even within these extraordinary suns, human fallibility was unavoidable. Decisions made without full understanding, while often correct in execution, occasionally introduced unintended deviations. Each choice, no matter how minor, carried the potential to amplify over time, creating subtle instabilities across the galaxy-spanning Imperium. Within the legions themselves, the effects of these pressures became apparent in quiet ways. Warriors trained diligently, maintained discipline, and executed campaigns with unmatched skill, yet the demands of governance, oversight, and diplomacy increasingly occupied their attention. Chaplains worked to enforce loyalty and unity, librarians monitored the warp with care, and commanders frequently deliberated on matters far beyond immediate tactical concerns. Even minor disagreement between officers or differences in interpretation of imperial directives became potential sources of tension, highlighting the delicate balance between authority and obedience, purpose and autonomy. Among the civilians of the Imperium, the process of integration produced both promise and unease. Worlds once fractured or isolated adjusted to new governance, trade, and communication networks, yet the imposition of the imperial truth often conflicted with long-standing traditions. Compliance, outwardly enforced and seemingly complete, frequently masked underlying discontent. Cultural practices quietly maintained, local authorities subtly resistant, and populations observing the limits of imperial patience. These small deviations, imperceptible to distant fleets or administrators, constituted a persistent undercurrent that, left unchecked, could influence the Imperium's stability in ways invisible until their consequences manifested. The galaxy itself, indifferent to human achievement, continued to offer reminders of its complexity and unpredictability. Warp storms disrupted travel, scattering convoys and delaying reinforcements. Discoveries of ancient civilizations and lost technologies highlighted humanity's limited understanding. Encounters with alien species, whether hostile or enigmatic, revealed intelligence and resilience that challenged even the most thorough planning. These factors underscored a simple truth. The brilliance of the Crusade did not imply immunity from danger, and mastery of territory could never guarantee mastery of consequence. Even as the Imperium expanded and flourished, the seeds of tension continued to accumulate. Differences among the Primarchs regarding the enforcement of doctrine, strategy, and governance persisted, subtle yet persistent. Worlds nominally compliant sometimes showed signs of dissatisfaction. Fleets operating across thousands of light years relied upon communication and interpretation that, despite its efficiency, was always subject to delay, misinterpretation, or unforeseen variables. Each of these factors contributed to a lattice of potential instability that had yet to manifest overtly but was growing steadily, invisibly, across the vastness of space. The Imperium's achievements remained extraordinary. Systems recovered from isolation, fleets executed precise campaigns, and the legions displayed skill and discipline without equal. Administrators and Mechanicum forces rebuilt infrastructure and reinstated technology once lost to time. Populations adjusted to imperial guidance, finding opportunity in connection to a larger human civilization. Outwardly, the crusade appeared unstoppable, a testament to the Emperor's vision and the effectiveness of his sons. Yet beneath this veneer of triumph, fractures had begun to form, subtle but inexorable. They were neither overt nor immediate, but persistent, a tension between philosophy and execution, loyalty and independence, vision and interpretation. The legions, even in their unmatched perfection, were not immune. The galaxy, vast and ancient, remained patient and indifferent, silently shaping the conditions in which these small instabilities might grow. And so, as fleets traced their luminous arcs among the stars and the legions marched across countless worlds, the first true indications of a greater fracture began to stir. They were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Within the brilliant expanse of the Imperium's golden age, the foundations of unity, loyalty, and purpose were being tested by forces that were subtle, patient, and inevitable. The stage was set, and the first threads of the disaster that would one day challenge the fate of the legions had already begun to weave themselves into the fabric of the crusade. In the vast reaches of the Imperium, the Great Crusade had achieved what generations of humanity had once only dreamed, an empire stretching across countless star systems, each brought under the dominion of the Emperor's will. Fleets traced elegant arcs between worlds, carrying not only warriors but administrators, engineers, and scholars who worked to bind these disparate regions into a cohesive civilization. The achievements of the Crusade were immense. Yet beneath their brilliance, subtle changes began to ripple through the structure of the Imperium, small shifts that were imperceptible to most but would prove significant in the years to come. The Primarchs, in their unmatched authority, felt the weight of these changes in ways both personal and structural. Each son of the Emperor, a reflection of his intent, was responsible not only for military campaigns but also for the welfare, loyalty, and integration of billions of souls across innumerable worlds. Some approached this responsibility with rigid discipline, emphasizing enforcement of the imperial truth and the necessity of absolute order. Others, shaped by worlds of hardship and unpredictability, recognized the subtle complexities of human behavior, advocating patience, negotiation, and a nuanced approach to loyalty. These differences, largely private and measured, introduced an imperceptible tension that ran through the leadership of the legions. Horus, as War Master, remained a figure of cohesion. His victories were frequent, his counsel sought by Primarchs and governors alike. Yet even he perceived the undercurrents of uncertainty that spread across the Imperium. Worlds that appeared obedient often contained latent discontent. Administrators sometimes misinterpreted directives or acted according to local priorities. Even the most disciplined legions occasionally exhibited minor lapses in judgment, subtle deviations that could accumulate if unchecked. Horus understood that while the Crusade's outward brilliance suggested invulnerability, the subtle balance of leadership, loyalty, and comprehension was fragile, relying upon the careful alignment of countless moving parts. The Emperor, distant and largely absent from the campaigns of the front lines, continued his work on Terra, overseeing projects of monumental scale and secrecy. His directives, delivered with precision and authority, guided the legions across thousands of systems, yet the delegation of interpretation to his Primarchs and commanders introduced the inevitability of variation. Even among his extraordinary sons, the necessity of human judgment meant that decisions sometimes diverged from intent in ways too subtle to detect immediately but capable of creating cumulative effects across the Imperium. Amid these challenges, the galaxy itself remained a reminder of humanity's limits. Warp anomalies disrupted fleets, scattering convoys or delaying critical reinforcements. Discoveries of ancient civilizations hinted at knowledge long lost, revealing both potential opportunity and risk. Encounters with alien species displayed intelligence, resilience, and technological advancement that sometimes challenge imperial assumptions. In each instance, the vastness and indifference of the universe underscore that the brilliance of the Crusade did not equate to total control or understanding. Within the legions, these factors influence both behavior and philosophy. Warriors continue their rigorous training, maintaining discipline and readiness, yet the demands of governance, oversight, and subtle diplomacy increasingly occupied their attention. Chaplains emphasize loyalty and unity, librarians exercised caution with the warp, and commanders debated matters that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. Even minor disagreements or philosophical differences between leaders became significant, introducing threads of tension beneath the surface of otherwise flawless execution. For ordinary humans, the presence of the Imperium offers stability and opportunity, yet it also imposed constraints. Worlds once isolated or fractured were integrated into trade, communication, and governance networks, yet compliance was often superficial. Local culture and tradition persisted in small, quiet ways, hidden beneath a veneer of obedience. These subtleties, imperceptible to distant fleets and often ignored in reports of victory, represented latent potential for divergence and unrest, demonstrating that even in triumph, the Imperium's control was not absolute. Despite these complexities, the Great Crusade's outward success remained undeniable. Systems were stabilized, fleets executed campaigns with remarkable efficiency, and the legions enforced law and order with unmatched skill. Administrators in the Mechanicum rebuilt infrastructure, restored lost technologies, and supported a civilization expanding across light years. Humanity's light, reflected in the radiance of the Emperor's banners, illuminated countless worlds. Yet beneath this brilliance, the first true hints of instability were forming, subtle and patient, like shadows at the edge of vision. Subtle fractures became apparent in councils of the Primarchs. Disagreements over doctrine, strategy, and governance, though discreet, revealed that even among the Emperor's sons, unity was maintained as much through mutual respect and careful diplomacy as through shared purpose. Worlds nominally loyal sometimes exhibited hidden resistance. Fleets relied upon coordination across vast distances, where miscommunication or delay could amplify minor deviations into meaningful consequences. These challenges, small though they were, accumulated imperceptibly, creating a lattice of potential vulnerability across the Imperium. And yet, the Crusade advanced, radiant and disciplined, its fleets traversing the stars, its legions imposing order wherever the emperors were extended. The Imperium appeared at its zenith, unstoppable in both power and ambition. Yet the galaxy, vast, patient, and indifferent, offered no guarantees. The brilliance of human achievement could not erase the subtle shadows that had begun to gather, shadows born of interpretation, distance, and the inevitable divergence of thought and circumstance. In this quiet accumulation, the first faint tremors of the disaster that would one day reshape the fate of the legions were forming. They were not yet visible as crises, nor did they manifest as open conflict. They were persistent, patient, and almost imperceptible, gathering in the spaces between victories, in the nuances of loyalty, and in the subtle differences of interpretation and temperament. And so, as the crusade continued, luminous and disciplined, humanity expanded its reach across the stars. The Emperor's vision remained absolute, and the Imperium's triumph seemed without limit. Yet beneath the brilliance, shadows had begun to stir. Small fractures, quiet yet inexorable, were gathering in the foundation of the Golden Age. The first real turning of events had begun, patient and unseen, and the stage for the trials that would test the unity, loyalty, and purpose of the legions was quietly being set. By the time the Crusade had advanced into the more remote sectors of the galaxy, the Imperium had achieved a scale previously unimagined by mortal minds. Star systems long lost to history were now linked in a vast network of communication, administration, and military oversight. Fleets moved with a precision that suggested inevitability, tracing the emperors across light years of empty space, while the legions, in their disciplined perfection, enforced order wherever it was required. Yet amid this triumph, the galaxy whispered reminders of complexity, unpredictability, and the limits of human control. Subtle fractures, imperceptible in isolation, began to appear within the structure of both the Imperium and the legions themselves, forming a network of tension that would quietly shape the course of history. The Primarchs, embodiments of the Emperor's vision, felt these pressures differently. Some, accustomed to worlds of strict discipline and order, viewed the emerging challenges as temporary aberrations, to be corrected with precision and authority. Others, forged in the fires of adversity, recognized that human loyalty and allegiance were not fixed, but delicate balances of trust, respect, and circumstance. Even among these extraordinary beings, disagreements arose over method, priority, and the interpretation of imperial intent. Though rarely voiced openly, these philosophical differences created subtle currents of friction carried beneath the surface of councils, campaigns, and ceremonial observances. Horus, as War Master, remained a stabilizing force among the Primarchs. His strategic brilliance and personal charisma inspired confidence in both commanders and subordinates, yet even he could not ignore the slow accumulation of tensions within the legions. Worlds once fully compliant began to show signs of minor unrest. Administrators occasionally acted in ways that reflected local concerns more than imperial doctrine. Even the most disciplined Astartes, tasked with maintaining order and projecting authority, sometimes revealed differing judgments in the execution of their duties. Horus, understanding the immense scale of responsibility, viewed these occurrences not as immediate threats but as subtle signals, indications that the balance of the Imperium relied upon constant vigilance, judgment, and foresight. The Emperor, meanwhile, remained distant, his focus on the vast projects of terror and on endeavors beyond the comprehension of any mortal required that his sons interpret his will across the galaxy. This delegation, though necessary, introduced the inevitability of variation. Even among the Primarchs, human and superhuman, judgment carried the risk of divergence from original intent. The Imperium, for all its outward brilliance, depended on layers of interpretation and assumption, each susceptible to small deviations whose cumulative effect could be profound over time. The galaxy itself provided constant reminders of its indifference. Warp storms disrupted fleet movements and communications. Encounters with alien civilizations revealed intelligence, technology, and resilience that tested imperial assumptions. Ruins of ancient human and Xeno societies hinted at histories too vast and complex for the Crusade to fully apprehend. These factors underscored the reality that even at the height of triumph, the Imperium remained subject to forces beyond its comprehension, forces whose consequences could not be fully controlled or predicted. Within the legions, the effects of these pressures were observed in discipline, governance, and vigilance. Warriors continued to train with unwavering dedication, yet their duties now extended beyond combat. Chaplains reinforced unity and doctrinal loyalty, librarians exercised caution in the use of warp powers, and commanders debated strategic and philosophical questions that had long-term implications. Even minor lapses in judgment, previously inconsequential, now assumed significance within the interconnected web of the Crusade, highlighting the delicate balance of authority and obedience, purpose and execution. Across newly incorporated worlds, human populations adapted to the presence of the Imperium with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The imperial truth, though presented as enlightenment and stability, often clashed with long-held cultural beliefs. While compliance was generally maintained, subtle forms of resistance persisted, hidden beneath outward obedience. These minor tensions, though often ignored in immediate reports of victory, formed an invisible network of potential unrest, demonstrating that the Imperium's influence, for all its grandeur, was never absolute. Amid these dynamics, small philosophical differences among the Primarchs continued to create nuanced friction. Some advocated rapid enforcement of doctrine, believing clarity and consistency would maintain unity. Others counseled patience, arguing that cultural nuances and human temperament required careful management to prevent rebellion or discontent. These debates, though discreet, revealed that even the Emperor's extraordinary sons were not immune to interpretation, opinion, and judgment, and that the success of the Crusade depended upon the careful alignment of their efforts and intentions. Despite these subtle tensions, the outward appearance of the Crusade remained radiant. Systems were brought under control, fleets executed precise campaigns, and the legions displayed skill, discipline, and adaptability beyond comparison. Administrators rebuilt infrastructure, restored lost technologies, and integrated populations into the Imperium. The Emperor's vision, though distant, manifested across countless star systems in the light of human achievement. Yet beneath this brilliance, the faint tremors of potential disruption gathered quietly, imperceptible to most, patient and persistent in the shadows of triumph. And so, as the Crusade continued its expansion across the stars, the Imperium appeared unstoppable, a shining civilization of unprecedented scale and order. Fleets traced paths among distant suns, legions enforced law and stability, and populations adjusted to new governance. Yet beneath the surface, subtle fractures persisted. Differences in philosophy, small lapses in compliance, and the inevitable divergence of human judgment combined to create an invisible lattice of tension. These quiet strains, growing imperceptibly over time, hinted at the fragility of even the most disciplined, orderly, and seemingly invincible structure. In the silence of space, among the brilliant arcs of warp travel and the disciplined march of countless warriors, the first real threads of discord had begun to weave themselves into the foundation of the Imperium. The age of triumph remained, radiant and imposing, yet beneath it, the seeds of challenge were quietly taking root. The subtle rift, almost imperceptible, had appeared, and it would one day grow to test the loyalty, unity, and destiny of the legions themselves. The Great Crusade, at its height, moved like a tidal wave across the galaxy, luminous and overwhelming in its scope. Yet beneath its brilliance, quiet shadows began to take shape. Even as entire star systems were brought under the Emperor's mandate, and fleets traced precise, unwavering courses through the void, there existed subtleties that none but the most perceptive could discern. The Imperium appeared flawless, a civilization carved from ambition, discipline, and unmatched power. Yet in its very vastness lay the conditions for the first truly dangerous imperfections, fractures that, though invisible to the casual observer, would grow in significance with each passing year. The Primarchs, instruments of the Emperor's will, were acutely aware of the pressures that accompanied such unprecedented expansion. Each son of the Emperor was extraordinary, yet extraordinary as they were, the scale of their command demanded judgment, patience, and discernment beyond mere martial skill. Some of the Primarchs applied the imperial truth and the Emperor's vision with unwavering rigidity, believing that the smallest deviation from doctrine would imperil the cohesion of the Crusade. Others, tempered by worlds of hardship and unpredictable adversity, approached with caution, acknowledging that human loyalty was delicate, that obedience could not be assumed to be eternal, and that even the smallest misstep might carry consequences that would echo across decades or centuries. These philosophical divergences, though seldom overtly expressed, introduced quiet tension among the sons of the Emperor, subtle but persistent beneath the surface of campaigns and councils. Horus, as war master, remained a central axis of unity. His victories inspired loyalty, and his counsel was sought by Primarchs and governors alike. Yet even he sensed a slow accretion of uncertainty within the Imperium. Worlds that had appeared fully obedient sometimes exhibited minor resistance, administrative reports that hinted at inefficiency, subtle cultural deviations from imperial mandates, or small but recurring disagreements between local governors and fleet commanders. Even the legions of Astartes, perfected as instruments of war and discipline, occasionally demonstrated differences in judgment, interpretations that reflected personal philosophy as much as imperial doctrine. Horus understood that the Crusade's outward perfection masked a reality more complex, that the stability of the Imperium rested upon countless interactions, decisions, and judgments, each carrying latent potential for divergence. The Emperor, distant and remote upon Terra, remained the unifying vision and the guiding hand of the Crusade, yet the delegation command introduced an inherent vulnerability. His instructions, precise and absolute, provided direction, but their interpretation relied upon the extraordinary, yet inevitably fallible, minds of his Primarchs and commanders. Even the smallest deviations in understanding, the slightest variation in execution, accumulated over the vast distances of space and time, creating subtle divergences that were almost impossible to detect in the moment but whose consequences could grow inexorably. The galaxy itself was a silent and indifferent observer. Warp storms disrupted communications and fleet movements, sometimes scattering vessels for months or years. Encounters with alien civilizations revealed intelligence, resilience, and technological sophistication that challenged imperial assumptions. Discoveries of long-dead human or Xeno civilizations hinted at knowledge and capabilities beyond comprehension, reminding the Crusade that the universe did not yield to ambition, planning, or strength alone. Each anomaly, each unforeseen event, underscored a simple truth. The brilliance of the Great Crusade did not confer mastery over fate, circumstance, or the vast unknown. Within the legions, these pressures manifested in both action and thought. Warriors continued to train and fight with unparalleled discipline, yet the demands of governance, oversight, and subtle diplomacy increasingly occupied their attention. Chaplains enforced loyalty and doctrinal cohesion, librarians monitored the warp with meticulous care, and commanders debated philosophical and strategic matters that had long-term consequences. Even minor disagreements, small divergences in interpretation, or differences of temperament introduced persistent, invisible currents of tension within the otherwise impeccable structure of the legions. Among the human populations integrated into the Imperium, the effects of the Crusade were profound yet complex. Worlds once fractured or isolated flourished under imperial guidance, benefiting from trade, technology, and protection. Yet the imposition of the imperial truth, though intended to unify and enlighten, often conflicted with deeply rooted cultural, religious, or societal traditions. Compliance was generally outwardly complete. Yet beneath the surface, small acts of quiet resistance persisted, subtle adaptations and concealed disobedience that reflected the resilience and unpredictability of the human spirit. These understated tensions, while often invisible in immediate reports, formed a lattice of potential instability across the Imperium. Even among the Primarchs, differences in philosophy regarding governance and strategy introduced subtle friction. Some advocated decisive enforcement of doctrine, believing that clarity and authority maintained order, while others counseled patience, noting that the integration of billions of individuals, each shaped by unique worlds and cultures, required nuanced management. These quiet debates, largely hidden from ordinary observation, demonstrated that even the Emperor's sons, whose authority was absolute in many respects, were nonetheless subject to the complex interplay of circumstance, judgment, and personal philosophy. Yet despite these subtle tensions, the outward brilliance of the Crusade endured. Fleets moved in flawless formation, worlds were stabilized, and the legions displayed skill, discipline, and dedication beyond all precedent. Administrators and Mechanicum forces rebuilt infrastructure and restored lost technologies, ensuring that the human population prospered. The Emperor's vision, though distant, was manifest across star systems, shining in the achievements of the Crusade. And yet, beneath the radiant surface, shadows persisted. Minor fractures in loyalty, philosophical divergence among the Primarchs, and the inevitable unpredictability of human nature combined to form subtle fissures in the foundation of the Imperium. These quiet, imperceptible disturbances were patient, waiting within the structure of conquest and governance, poised to grow as the Crusade expanded further into the unknown. As the Great Crusade continued its outward sweep, triumphant and disciplined, the galaxy watched silently. The Imperium's achievements were extraordinary, yet in the calm after each victory, the subtle tremors of unseen instability gathered. Like distant clouds on a horizon too far to see clearly, the first seeds of the challenges that would one day test the unity, loyalty, and destiny of the legions were quietly being sown. And in this silence, the stage was being set for the trials that would define the age to come. The Great Crusade, radiant in its apparent perfection, continued to sweep across the galaxy, linking star systems under the banner of the Emperor, binding disparate worlds into a vast and ordered civilization. Fleets traced disciplined arcs through warp and real space, carrying warriors, administrators, and scholars to enforce law, integrate populations, and recover lost knowledge. The legions, instruments of almost absolute power, executed campaigns with unwavering precision. Yet beneath the brilliance of conquest, subtle and persistent strains began to emerge. These were not conflicts of war, nor were their revolts or rebellions easily seen, but quiet divergences in philosophy, interpretation, and execution that would, in time, reveal the fragility of even the most disciplined and seemingly perfect machinery. Each Primarch, extraordinary beyond measure and yet uniquely shaped by circumstance, felt the weight of these subtle tensions differently. Some, forged on worlds of rigid order and discipline, so the emerging uncertainties as temporary disturbances to be corrected swiftly and decisively. Others, raised amid hardship and chaos, understood that human loyalty was never absolute, that it could not be commanded into existence without care, observation, and sometimes patience. These philosophical differences, largely private and unspoken, introduced gentle undercurrent of friction among the Emperor's sons, differences that, though invisible to most, slowly affected the dynamics of councils, campaigns, and governance across the Imperium. Horus, as War Master, remained a figure of cohesion and influence. His victories inspired confidence, his counsel shaped strategy, and his presence calmed both officers and Primarchs alike. Yet even he was aware of the subtle accumulation of doubt and uncertainty spreading across the Imperium. Worlds that seemed compliant occasionally demonstrated minor signs of unrest, administrative reports hinting at inefficiency, discrepancies between expectation and execution, and populations quietly maintaining customs contrary to imperial doctrine. The legions themselves, for all their discipline and superhuman perfection, were not immune to minor divergences in judgment and interpretation, reflecting the humanity that persisted even within the Emperor's greatest creations. The Emperor, seated upon terror and focus on monumental works beyond ordinary comprehension, remained distant. His directives guided the crusade, yet they required interpretation. Even the Primarchs, embodiments of his will, were required to exercise judgment, often balancing intention against circumstance. Small deviations in understanding, slight alterations in execution, or subtle differences in philosophical approach accumulated across light years of space, forming imperceptible but persistent divergences in the Imperium's cohesion. The galaxy itself, vast and indifferent, reinforced the Imperium's limitations. Warp storms scattered fleets, delayed communications, and forced ships to reroute across empty space. Encounters with alien civilizations revealed intelligence and technology that challenged the assumptions of imperial planners. Ruins of ancient societies hinted at knowledge lost of time and memory, presenting both opportunity and danger. Each anomaly, disruption, or encounter served as a reminder that no matter the brilliance of human endeavor, the universe remained vast, unknowable, and unconcerned with triumph order. Within the legions, these pressures shaped both thought and action. Warriors trained relentlessly, maintained discipline, and executed campaigns with unmatched precision, yet their responsibilities increasingly extended into governance, diplomacy, and oversight. Chaplains emphasized loyalty and ideological cohesion, librarians exercised caution in the use of the warp, and commanders debated strategy and philosophical nuance with care. Minor disagreements or differences in temperament, which once might have been inconsequential, now carried significance, contributing to subtle tension beneath the surface of the legion's outward unity. Human populations integrated into the Imperium adapted unevenly. Worlds once fractured or isolated flourished under imperial guidance, yet the imposition of the imperial truth, though intended to unify, often clashed with long-standing traditions and beliefs. Compliance was frequently outward, but beneath it, quiet adaptations, covert resistance, and the persistence of local customs reminded the legions that loyalty was rarely absolute. These small deviations, subtle and unreported, created a network of potential instability that stretched across sectors and light years, imperceptible until amplified by circumstance or error. Even among the Primarchs, philosophical divergences continued to grow. Some argued that rapid enforcement of doctrine was necessary to preserve unity, while others counseled patience, noting that the nuances of human behavior required careful management to avoid unintended consequences. These differences, largely private, highlighted a fundamental truth. Even among the Emperor's sons, extraordinary as they were, absolute unanimity of thought and method was impossible. The unity of the crusade was maintained through trust, diplomacy, and careful calibration, rather than perfect alignment of will. Outwardly, however, the crusade remained brilliant. Fleets advanced across the stars, worlds were stabilized and reconstructed, and the legions executed orders with unparalleled skill. Administrators rebuilt infrastructure, the Mechanicum restored lost technologies, and populations prospered under the guidance of human oversight. The Emperor's vision was manifest across thousands of systems, and the Imperium appeared unstoppable. Yet beneath this veneer, subtle fractures persisted. Philosophical differences among the Primarchs, minor lapses in obedience, and the inevitable unpredictability of human nature combined to form small fissures in the Imperium's foundation. These quiet tensions, patient and unseen, gathered in the background of conquest and governance, invisible to all but the most perceptive observers. As the crusade pressed forward, radiant and disciplined, the galaxy itself waited silently. The Imperium's triumphs were immense, yet in the quiet spaces between victories, the first faint tremors of real disruption had begun to stir. These were imperceptible now, almost too subtle to notice, yet persistent. Beneath the brilliance of the Golden Age, the seeds of doubt, dissonance, and eventual disaster were quietly being sown. And as the stars stretched outward, bearing the banners of the Emperor across the void, the stage for the trials that would one day test the loyalty, unity, and destiny of the legions was already being prepared in shadow and silence. The Great Crusade had now entered its later stages, and the Imperium stretched across a vast swath of the galaxy, seemingly immutable in its might and boundless in its reach. Fleets carved glowing paths through warp and real space, their courses precise, their destinations unquestioned, while the legions moved across innumerable worlds as both warriors and administrators, enforcing law, imposing order, and guiding populations toward unity under the Emperor's banner. Triumphs were celebrated across thousands of systems, and the light of the Imperium's expansion seemed absolute. Yet beneath the brilliance of conquest, imperceptible shifts began to emerge, small, subtle movements in loyalty, judgment, and philosophy that would, over time, grow into forces capable of challenging even the Emperor's extraordinary vision. Among the Primarchs, the weight of these subtle pressures was keenly felt. Some, tempered by worlds of rigid structure and discipline, responded with immediate corrective measures, seeking to ensure that every deviation, however minor, was swiftly rectified. Others, shaped by adversity and unpredictability, recognized the complexity of human behavior, understanding that loyalty could not be commanded, but rather cultivated, observed, and sometimes guided with patience. These differences, though largely unspoken, produced faint currents of tension among the Emperor's sons, subtle and persistent beneath the surface of councils, campaigns, and ceremonial gatherings, hinting at the fragility of even the most disciplined and cohesive forces. Horus, as war master and first among equals, continued to serve as a stabilizing influence across the legions. His victories inspired devotion, his counsel shaped strategy, and his judgment was respected by Primarchs and commanders alike. Yet even he perceived the gradual accumulation of unease, the quiet stirrings of discord that spread across the Imperium. Worlds that appeared fully compliant sometimes harbored minor resistance, administrative reports that hinted at inefficiency, subtle cultural divergences from imperial norms, and populations quietly persisting in traditional practices contrary to the imperial truth. Even the legions of Astartes, disciplined to superhuman perfection, occasionally demonstrated minor differences in judgment or interpretation, subtle reflections of the humanity embedded within them. Horus understood that these small anomalies, though not immediately threatening, were signals of underlying complexity that required attention and careful oversight. The Emperor, distant upon Terra, remained the guiding force of the Crusade, his will absolute yet mediated through the judgment of his extraordinary sons. His instructions were precise and immutable, yet the necessity of human interpretation meant that variations in execution were inevitable. Even the most disciplined Primarchs, whose authority was near divine, could not act without exercising judgment. These variations, often imperceptible at first, accumulated over vast distances and extended periods, introducing minor divergences that, though hidden in the present, had the potential to manifest profoundly in the future. The galaxy itself continued to serve as a reminder of humanity's limitations. Warp storms disrupted fleets and communications, scattering vessels for months at a time. Encounters with alien species, some intelligent, others inscrutable, revealed capacities and resilience that challenge imperial assumptions. Ancient ruins hinted at civilizations and knowledge beyond human comprehension, presenting opportunity and danger in equal measure. These factors reinforce the truth that, despite the brilliance of the Crusade, mastery over space, populations, and circumstance was always provisional, always subject to variables beyond calculation. Within the legions, the cumulative weight of these pressures manifested quietly. Warriors maintained discipline, trained relentlessly, and executed orders flawlessly, yet the responsibilities of governance and oversight increasingly tested their judgment. Chaplains reinforced loyalty and ideological cohesion, librarians exercised measured caution with the warp, and commanders weighed tactical, philosophical, and political considerations in every campaign. Even minor disagreements in philosophy, interpretation, or approach were amplified by the scale of operations, creating subtle but persistent currents of tension that threaded through the legion's otherwise impeccable order. Across human populations, the Imperium's influence produced both prosperity and subtle resistance. Worlds once isolated or fractured flourished under the Emperor's guidance, yet the imposition of the imperial truth often collided with entrenched beliefs and local customs. Compliance, while generally apparent, frequently masked quiet acts of adaptation or concealed defiance, subtle forms of human resilience that went unnoticed by the fleets and officers overseeing these worlds. These small divergences, though seemingly inconsequential, form a lattice of latent instability that, when combined with other pressures, could amplify over time into forces capable of challenging the cohesion of imperial authority. Even among the Primarchs, philosophical differences continued to shape the course of governance and command. Some favored strict enforcement of doctrine, believing that clarity and certainty preserved unity. Others counseled patience, noting that imposing uniformity across billions of individuals, each shaped by unique worlds, required discernment and subtlety. These quiet tensions, largely hidden from view, reveal the delicate balance on which the Crusade depended, a harmony maintained not through absolute agreement, but through careful calibration of trust, diplomacy, and judgment. Outwardly, the Crusade remained magnificent. Fleets advanced, worlds were stabilized, and the legions carried out campaigns with skill unmatched in human history. Administrators and mechanicum forces rebuilt infrastructure and restored technologies lost to time. The Emperor's vision, though distant, was tangible across countless systems. Yet beneath this brilliance, subtle fractures persisted, patiently weaving themselves into the foundation of the Imperium. And so, as the Great Crusade continued its sweeping advance, radiant and disciplined, the first true stirrings of discord quietly took shape. These tremors were imperceptible to most, almost invisible within the vast machinery of the Imperium, yet persistent and patient. Beneath the triumph and expansion, seeds of doubt, divergence, and imperfection were being sown, waiting silently in the background, prepared to challenge the unity, loyalty, and destiny of the legions in the years to come. The galaxy, vast and eternal, observed in silence, and the stage for trials yet unimagined was being set with meticulous patience, hidden in the shadows beneath the light of humanity's golden age. As the Great Crusade extended deeper into the remote regions of the galaxy, the Imperium appeared unstoppable, its influence stretching across countless star systems, each linked to another by fleets, administrators, and the guiding presence of the Emperor's sons. The light of human dominion illuminated worlds' long-lost isolation, bringing stability, technology, and order where once there had been only uncertainty. The legions, instruments of unparalleled power and discipline, executed campaigns with precision, administering both conquest and governance with extraordinary efficiency. Yet, even at the height of this brilliance, the first imperceptible shift began to emerge, subtle deviations, quiet divergences, and small lapses that, though easily ignored at the time, would grow into forces capable of reshaping the future of the Imperium. Among the Primarchs, the pressures of scale and responsibility were felt acutely. Some, forged upon worlds of rigid discipline, approached these emerging anomalies with swift correction and rigorous oversight, determined that no deviation, however minor, would jeopardize the unity of the Crusade. Others, molded by adversity and unpredictable environments, recognized that human loyalty was never absolute, that obedience could not be commanded without care and discernment, and that subtle patience was often necessary to maintain cohesion. These differences, largely private and unspoken, introduced faint but persistent currents of tension, rippling quietly through councils, campaigns, and moments of decision, hinting at the fragility of even the most disciplined and seemingly perfect forces. Horus, elevated as war master, continued to serve as a figure of stabilizing authority. His strategic vision and personal charisma inspired trust, while his victories in council maintained confidence across the legions and the imperial hierarchy. Yet even he noted the accumulation of subtle unrest and quiet anomalies across the Imperium. Worlds that appeared obedient sometimes displayed minor resistance, administrative reports suggesting inefficiency, discrepancies between expectation and execution, and populations preserving local customs contrary to the imperial truth. Even the superhuman legions of Astartes occasionally displayed minor divergences in judgment or interpretation, subtle reflections of individuality and circumstance within otherwise perfect warriors. Horus recognized that these small signals, though not threatening in isolation, were indications of underlying complexity that required careful attention and anticipation. The Emperor, distant upon terror and absorbed in works beyond the comprehension of even his most trusted sons, remained the unifying force and guiding vision of the crusade. His instructions were absolute, precise, and immutable, yet the delegation of command across light years introduced human judgment into every act of implementation. Even the Primarchs, whose abilities and insight far exceeded mortal measure, were required to make decisions, interpret context, and weigh circumstance. Minor deviations in execution, slight variations in interpretation, and subtle philosophical differences accumulated across sectors and systems, imperceptible at first but capable of exerting profound influence over time. The galaxy itself continued to remind humanity of its limits. Warp storms disrupted fleet movements and communications, scattering ships for months or even years. Encounters with alien civilizations, some hostile, others enigmatic, revealed intelligence, technology, and resilience that challenge imperial assumptions. Ancient ruins and remnants of lost human and xeno societies hinted at knowledge beyond comprehension, offering both opportunity and peril. These circumstances underscored a simple, unchanging truth. The brilliance of the Crusade could not grant absolute mastery over the galaxy, nor over the unpredictable nature of life and consequence. Within the legions, these pressures shaped thought, action, and discipline. Warriors trained relentlessly, enforced order, and executed campaigns with unmatched skill, yet their responsibilities extended beyond combat. Chaplains reinforced loyalty and doctrinal cohesion, librarians monitored the warp with extreme care, and commanders deliberated on matters of strategy, philosophy, and governance. Even minor differences in judgment, temperament, or interpretation carried significance, forming invisible currents of tension within an otherwise flawless apparatus of military and administrative perfection. Across the populations of newly integrated worlds, human responses were complex. Prosperity accompanied imperial guidance, yet cultural and social differences persisted. The imperial truth, though intended to unify and enlighten, often conflicted with deeply rooted customs, beliefs, and traditions. Compliance was frequently outward, but quiet resistance, subtle adaptations, and concealed continuities persisted beneath the surface. These small acts, seemingly inconsequential, created a lattice of latent instability that, when combined with other forces, could gradually manifest as real challenges to unity and order. Even among the Primarchs, philosophical divergences influenced the conduct of governance and command. Some argue that rapid enforcement of doctrine preserved cohesion and minimized uncertainty. Others counseled patience, noting that billions of individuals from worlds shaped by vastly different circumstances could not be treated uniformly without risking subtle instability. These debates, largely invisible to ordinary observers, demonstrated that even the Emperor's sons were subject to variation, interpretation, and judgment, and that the success of the Crusade relied upon careful calibration of trust, alignment, and oversight. Outwardly, the Great Crusade remained magnificent. Fleets advanced with precision, worlds were stabilized and rebuilt, and the legions executed orders with discipline unmatched in human history. Administrators in the Mechanicum restored infrastructure and ancient technology, ensuring prosperity and continuity for countless civilizations. The Emperor's vision, though distant, radiated across systems, manifest in the extraordinary achievements of humanity. Yet beneath the surface, subtle fractures persisted, patient and imperceptible, weaving themselves quietly into the foundation of the Imperium. And so, as the Crusade continued its sweeping advance, triumphant and luminous, the first imperceptible stirrings of real discord began to take shape. These tremors were invisible to most, almost too slight to detect within the vast machinery of the Imperium, yet persistent, patient, and unavoidable. Beneath the brilliance of conquest, the seeds of doubt, divergence, and imperfection were being sown. In the silence between victories and the calm that followed campaigns, the stage for the trials that would one day test the loyalty, unity, and destiny of the legions was being carefully, inexorably prepared. Even as humanity reached the stars in triumph, the quiet, imperceptible shift had begun, and with it, the first true hints of disaster that would one day alter the fate of the Emperor's greatest sons.